So I don't know about you, but before I had any experience in accounting, when I thought about leases, I thought about apartment leases and auto leases, and beyond that, I didn't really think that leases were all that important or all that popular. Didn't take much just getting into intermediate accounting to learn that actually leases are quite popular in the business world, and so that's what we want to talk to you about today. We're going to give a little bit of a background and just provide some color on what leases are, how they're used, how they're classified, and then specifically we're going to focus on some key differences between how leases are accounted for in US GAAP versus IFRS. We're going to talk about differences in presentation, differences in terminology, differences in how transactions are accounted for, and then we're going to wrap up by talking about some differences in the conversation that's going on, talking about convergence as we try and make GAAP align better with IFRS and vice versa. Before we jump into all that, I just want to provide a little background on how common leases are. I found that in the United States, of all the capital equipment in place, 30% of it is leased. And in fact, this is just for capital equipment leases, not excluding then real estate operating and capital real estate leases. 80% of companies lease capital equipment to some extent or another. I found some pretty interesting information noting that 70% of all leased equipment is transportation or office related, and to give you some specifics on that, we're talking dollar value here. 16% of all leased assets are actually railroad assets, which I would not have guessed. Coming up after railroad assets, we've computers computer equipment accounts for about 11% of the dollar value of all leased assets. Aircraft come in third at 10%, and then followed at about 6 to 7% each. Trucks and trailers, electrical power equipment, agricultural equipment, general office equipment like copiers, and then manufacturing, industrial equipment, and construction equipment. If you wonder why these are so popular, some of the benefits of leasing would then be that it requires, or can be structured to require, very little down payments from lessees. They can get 100% financing. It helps if a company is entering into a lease, it will know its costs, and it'll know every month, this is my cost for this equipment. It doesn't necessarily have to pay maintenance costs on the equipment, at least not if it's an operating lease. And also, they may potentially always have new equipment. They don't need to deal with obsolescence. And then lastly, depending on the type of lease, if it's an operating lease, this sort of structured transaction can lead to off-balance sheet financing, so the company doesn't need to show all that it owes on its balance sheet.
All right, so the main thing that I really realized as I was researching the difference between accounting for leases under both IFRS and GAAP is that they're really pretty similar. One of the main differences is the terminology. While IFRS uses the term indicator to describe situations which lease could be classified as capital, GAAP uses the term criteria. And while IFRS uses the term finance, GAAP uses the term capital to describe capital leases. You can really tell just by this terminology that indicators is more of it alludes more to that it could be used to describe a capital lease, where criteria is just really sounds like it's a rule-based. If it's this, then it has to be a capital lease. The next difference was that IFRS really stresses substance over form, and while GAAP is more specific with what constitutes a capital lease. For instance, if you look at the third criteria for lease classification as capital, it has to do with the lease term compared to the estimated economic life of the equipment. While GAAP comes right out and says 75% is of the estimated economic life, IFRS says a major portion of the economic life. And for minimum lease payments, while GAAP says that 90% of the fair value will make it a capital lease, IFRS just says substantially all. So this really comes down to IFRS being more judgment-based, while GAAP is more rule-based. GAAP just tells you straight up what rules you need to follow, and IFRS isn't exactly as clear-cut. There's also some extra criteria under IFRS. Both share the same core criteria of transfer of ownership, a bargain purchase option, the lease term, and minimum lease payments. But there's also a fifth indicator under IFRS, which is that if the leased assets are of a specialized nature that they can only be used by the lessee without major modifications being made, then it's an indicator that it should be classified as a capital or finance lease. There are also 3 more indicators that may cause a lease to be classified as a financing or capital lease. These are if the lessee is entitled to cancel the lease and the lessor's losses associated with the cancellation are borne by the lessee, then it can be classified as a finance or capital lease. If gains or losses from fluctuations in fair value of the residual fall to the lessee, for example by means of a rebate or lease payments, then it can be classified as a capital or finance lease. And if the lessee has the ability to continue to lease for a secondary period of time at a rent that is substantially lower than market rent, or a bargain renewal option, then it can be classified as a finance or capital lease.
Thank you very much for my team member Spencer's presentation on the overview of lease and Zach's presentation on analyzing the differences of lease. I'm going to talk about 2 examples to show you the differences of lease. I choose 2 companies in the same industry. They are the most influential internet sellers in the world now. One is Amazon from US and the other is Alibaba from China. And you may already very familiar with Amazon, and I will use this opportunity to talk about more about the information of Alibaba. The key to the success of Alibaba, which was listed in New York Stock Exchange last year as the biggest IPO in history, is that it has very extensive lines of the business. For example, it has the shipping and warehousing and financing for both sellers and buyers. In China, for example, the market share of Alibaba in the C2C field is more than 95%. And in the B2C market, the Alibaba's market share is more than half. Whereas Amazon's market share is only 2.7% in 2014. Amazon's strategy in China is not so successful, and in the last months it gave up its own platform and even set up a store in Alibaba. So I guess it will be soon for the US consumers in future to buy the products directly from Alibaba in the US. The findings to analyzing these 2 companies are quite interesting. these two companies are from the Western culture and Oriental culture, and the major difference is in the wording. They choose the different words to record the lease, and that is also part of the reason they are in a different stage of their growth. Alibaba now is quite new in the US, so it has fewer expansion in its warehouse, so that the information we found to show the difference in lease is quite limited. That also give us enlightenment that though lease is very important to our daily life, is of the strategic importance to our company, but for a certain company, for a certain business in their nature, lease may not be a very big component. And we also need to take into consideration the cultural impact when we compare two companies from different backgrounds. Thank you.
All right, so you had an idea of some of the small differences between how IFRS and GAAP refer to leases, but one of the more significant differences is how they recognize a gain or loss in a sale-leaseback. And a sale-leaseback is when one sells an asset then leases it back for a long term. Okay, so under GAAP, with respect to operating a leaseback, if the seller does not give up more than a minor part of the right to use the asset, then the gain or loss is deferred and amortized over the length of the lease. And then under IFRS, the gain or loss is recognized immediately. And then under a capital or a finance leaseback, GAAP does the same thing as a operating leaseback. And then IFRS, the gain or loss is deferred and then amortized over the length of the lease. All right, so my first example is Sears Holding Corporation. It's a multi-million corporation in Hoffman Estate, Illinois, and it was the latest retailer to tap into real estate value of its stores. It had a multi-million-dollar turnaround plan where it filed a rights offering to form a real estate investment trust, Seritage Growth Properties. And a real estate investment trust is a company that owns and operates income-producing real estate, such as hospitals and hotels. And then Seritage intends to use the money it raises to finance its purchase of 254 store properties, mostly consisting of Kmart and Sears properties. And then along with the filing, Sears Holding Corporation and General Growth Properties announced a 50-50 joint venture and a sale-leaseback agreement that with 12 current Sears stores located in General Growth Properties malls. As part of the transaction, General Growth Properties invests $33 million to acquire Seritage common shares, and then in return, Sears Leaseback contributed properties under a triple net master agreement with 10-year with 5-year renewal option, and then a triple net master agreement is where the leasee pays for the net real estate taxes, the building insurance, and then the general maintenance to the properties. And then other companies are also pushing for those, pushing for that direction, such as Pinnacle Entertainment, Penn National Gaming, two of which are casinos, and then investors in McDonald's are also pushing that way. All right. So my second example is Air France, which is an airliner, and a lot of airliners have trouble financing their aircraft, so they form a sale-leaseback. A sale leaseback helps airliners in debt or low on cash make funds by selling owned aircraft to leasors and then leasing back the aircraft on favorable terms. And then the money realized by selling aircraft is used for more productive purposes by airliners. And then they use the equity tied up in the aircraft to make more profitable adjustments to their corporation instead of having to focus on the aircraft. And then one of my examples is Air France. Back in July 28, 2010, they formed a leaseback agreement with Air Lease Corporation, which is an American corporation in the U.S.
So my colleagues have discussed the differences that exist between IFRS and GAAP in the way that we account for leases. And then Maynard just discussed one tenet of lease accounting, the sale-leaseback. I'm going to discuss the convergence, the striving for convergence that the IASB and the FASB have worked on and continue to work on to reach convergence. After half a decade of communication, discussions, they have decided that leases that are longer than 12 months do need to be reported on a balance sheet. However, they part in how they want to treat those leases. IASB in August stated that they want to have one type of lease only, and that it will be treated as a financing arrangement where the interest expense will be on the company's income statement. FASB will have two. Type A, which is treated just like AASB, and in addition a Type B, which will be treated as a straight line expense and expensed over the term of the lease. So for corporations, these changes and requirements will impact them possibly significantly. One way is, of course, the balance sheet, as well as the key ratios that we get from those financial statements, and maybe most especially in a company's ability to obtain financing. So, for example, by having to put more leases on a balance sheet, that would cause a company's debt-to-equity ratio to increase, and this could make a company appear to be a more risky choice to give financing to. It's difficult to project exactly how these changes are going to affect corporations, but many corporations fear that the cost to make these changes, to change to a more IFRS-based language, will be a great cost that companies and auditors will bear. And it will affect all aspects of business, including auditing, contracts, reporting, and also when decisions are made, will they need to be implemented retrospectively. So currently, the FASB chairman, Russell Golden, stated in an interview with Bloomberg BNA that IASB and FASB continue to work for convergence, and that they hope to release a new standard. However, it seems that the quest for an identical standard has been replaced by one with the goal of minimizing the differences between the two standards boards.
As you all know, lease is very important to business organizations and our lives because it comes in various forms. It can be as small as a pair of roller skates. It also can be as huge as building. And moreover, we make leases every day. So, however, the leasing is more important for its business purpose. On the one hand, there are companies with need for asset but couldn't afford it. On the other hand, they will have a company who has the asset but couldn't utilize it. So they make a lease agreement together, and it's a win-win for both. And lessee get the asset that they want, and the lessor will earn money on that asset. So, in conclusion, there are not significant difference between IFRS and GAAP on the subject of leases. The minor differences are, as Zach pointed out, that there are like extra criteria for efforts, and as Maynard said, there are like difference in recognition of gain and loss on leaseback, and like Zach and G comment on the layout and format difference, and at last Breed said Breed showed us the issue of the convergence is still under debating. So I think it is really difficult to predict what's gonna happen in the future. Thank you. Do you got any questions?